So there's a famous story, which I'm sure all of you have heard before, which is that when the Buddha was asked if he was a god, his reply was, "No, I'm awake." So there's a direct relationship between the awakening to enlightened awareness and the capacity to see more. So it makes sense to me, and I think we all would agree that if enlightenment means anything, one of the things that it means is that the one who has access to enlightened awareness sees more than those who are not. And my understanding of how this happens is really very simple, but it's important to understand how it works. Enlightenment is about transcending the ego. Not a new idea, everybody already knows that. But it actually is really true. Whatever enlightened awareness is, it appears to the degree that the small self, the ego mind, the separate personality, personal separate identity is transcended, even if only temporarily. So the reason that the access to enlightened awareness enables us to see more is because in someone who has attained a relative degree of stability in the awakening to enlightened awareness means that they're, as a result of a profound awakening experience, is usually what the catalyst is. As the result of a profound awakening experience, a powerful awakening experience, if it's deep enough and profound enough and intense enough and long-lasting enough, it burns a hole in the ego. So it really burns a hole in the separate self sense, in our unique separate identity. A hole is burned by the light of enlightened awareness. The light of enlightened awareness comes from the source of reality, the source of creation, from the ground of being. So it means, if you can imagine it, that if the ego is a big circle, it's our separate identity, our ego mind, that this awakening experience is the direct cognizance of the penetrating light, which is the energy and intelligence that created the universe, and the energy and intelligence that creates the universe, burns a hole in our separate identity, and if it's deep, if that hole is burned deep enough, it lasts, it remains. After the experience, one remains to some degree changed, because now there's a permanent hole in our separate identity. It doesn't mean our separate identity has gone, has disappeared, has vanished forever. Egos don't tend to vanish forever. On good days, they might seem to have taken a vacation, but they usually come back and take their seat again. So the ego rarely disappears for very long. And whenever it does disappear, it always comes back. But if our experience of enlightened awareness, if our experience of enlightened awareness has been deep enough and profound enough, it will burn a permanent hole in our separate self sense, which would leave us to some degree permanently transformed. And the degree of that transformation depends upon how profound the experience was. Some people have a small enlightenment that lasts. Some people have a big enlightenment that lasts. Some people have an enormous enlightenment that lasts. But we are in this metaphorical image I'm giving, we want to understand that the enlightenment is this permanent hole that has been burned through the fabric of the separate self sense, the fabric of our separate identity, the ego mind. It means from that moment on, no matter how temporarily identified we may be with the contents of our mind and ego, the presence of eternity, the grounded being, the evolutionary impulse, the source of consciousness, the source of creativity, the source of existence is always vibrating. It's always to some degree present in our awareness. It means we always know who we really are, no matter how things may appear to be in any moment. So this is very important now. The effect of the awakening to enlightened awareness gives one a capacity to, as I said, see more. Someone is truly enlightened, who truly has access to enlightened awareness, it means they should be able to see more. And they should be able to demonstrate the fact that they see more in how they report their observations. And if you ever spend time with someone who actually has access to enlightened awareness, you'll be able to tell after a while. They will indicate to you through their own behavior that they see more than you do. And you'll realize, oh, I didn't see what they saw. Even though you might have been having the same experience at the same time or been in the same place with them, by how they report their own experience, you'll be able to tell that they could see more than you did. Now, for someone who seems to have a capacity to see more and know more than you do, we do, it simply means that they've been paying more attention than you have. And so that's what I wanted to talk about. Where we put our attention. Where are we putting our attention? And what is it that makes it possible for us to see more than we used to? So seeing more is not just a matter of making the effort to pay more attention. An unenlightened person can make more effort to pay attention, but that's not going to give them access to enlightened awareness necessarily. There has to be another mysterious element there that's going to make it possible to break through to the other side. In my own case, when I met my teacher, he's told me that I asked him how much effort did I have to make to be free, which in this context would be to be able to see more deeply to the nature of reality. And his answer was, you don't have to make any effort to do that. So in his answer, through his answer, I actually had an experience when I stopped making the effort to try and see more deeply, more clearly. And it was as a result of the letting go, a capacity for deeper seeing emerged spontaneously and naturally. So what I've noticed over the years, and I continue to notice, is that our capacity for seeing deeply and seeing clearly and seeing more and knowing more and feeling more and being more conscious depends on what's most important to us. So the reason that a lot of people don't have the capacity for penetrating clarity and penetrating depth is because that's not the first on their list of priorities. That's why in this teaching, the foundation of the teaching is the cultivation of the aspiration to be able to gain access to the penetrating depth and penetrating clarity as an existential priority. It's more important for me to be able to see clearly and have access to penetrating depth than anything else is. Most people just don't think that way, don't feel that way. That's why so few people are actually awake. And as we all know that, as I'm fond of saying, that it's easy to wake up, but most people fall back asleep very quickly. So throughout the day, when you're paying, because we're all paying, one thing I wanted to say at the beginning of the call was paying attention simply means giving focused presence to the inherent depth of our own experience of conscious awareness, which is what meditation is all about. So when you start paying attention to the nature of your own conscious attention, you start paying attention to it, paying attention to your own experience of consciousness, the ground of your own being in every single moment. You are awake, you are aware. There's something very miraculous about simply paying attention to paying attention. It's like discovering, oh, I'm awake. I didn't even know it. I've actually been awake all the time, but I hadn't even known it. Which is kind of what happens when you do wake up. You discover that you've been awake your whole life, but you didn't even know it. You were sleepwalking through life when the awareness was always there all the time. You just didn't give any attention to it. Because as I'm fond of saying, we're always busy with the content of consciousness, very rarely busy with giving attention to the nature of consciousness. And the pursuit of enlightened awareness is the pursuit of the awakened to the nature of our own experience of consciousness in every moment. And there's a miraculous quality of ever newness about your own consciousness when you discover it. Say, oh, that's what it is. I remember when I came to India in 1984, I read a book by about Ramana Maharshi's teachings, and he said, what you're looking for is always already there, and you'll be surprised when you discover that it's been there all along. And most people, when they hear that, they don't really believe it. But it's true. One day in my early years here in 1984, I was at a beach in a beach in Bengal, and I decided to stay up all night and meditate. And I stayed up all night on the roof of this bungalow I was in on the beach, and I meditated all night long. And nothing particularly interesting happened. It was kind of boring, miraculous. But then in the morning, I went for a walk on the beach by myself when I was finished. And I experienced this penetrating insight that really swept me off my feet. Because during that walk, I saw that my mind, or the mind, is just a filter. And it became apparent to me that what I was looking for, the light of enlightened awareness, was so ever so close. It was right there. It was already there. And I could see through the mirage that the mind creates all the time, but I actually saw it as a mirage. I saw it as a very thin veil. I could see through the veil. The veil was still there, but I could see through it. It became transparent for a few moments. And it was so exhilarating because then I knew I was on my way. I knew that it was what I was looking for was not far off. So the miracle of all this depends upon what we are actually interested in, what we're putting our attention on throughout the day. Most of us were busy with all kinds of other things, distracted by our ego's agenda, in which we're also entrenched. The ego is so distracted all the time by its own fears and its own desires. And it's hypnotizing. And the terrifying thing is we can waste a whole human life being utterly lost and totally unconscious in our ego's agenda, which is also culturally conditioned, but without even knowing it. So in terms of paying attention, there's context and there's content. There's context and there's content. So for example, as we see our experience, as we feel our experience, as we have our experience, even as we think about our experience, what's the context in which we're seeing our experience, feeling our experience, and having our experience? What's the context in which all that's actually happening? Because the context, which is going to be the particular vantage point through which and from which we're observing all of it, will inform all the conclusions we're going to be making about what's happening inside us and outside us and all around us. So what's the context or the vantage point in which you're seeing and feeling and experiencing the reality of conscious experience. What's the vantage point? What's the context that you're working through, that you're working with, knowingly or unknowingly, consciously or unconsciously? So there's the context in which your experience is happening, which we need to become conscious of. We need to make ourselves conscious of it if we're going to wake up, if we're going to be awake. And then there's the content of our experience. So the content of our experience is whatever we experience: thoughts, feelings, fears, desires, memories, dreams, hopes. Whatever the content is what it is. So some meditative traditions teach us how to pay attention to the content of our experience, which is called the practice of mindfulness. But I don't think it's enough just to pay attention to the context. To the content of our experience. If you pay attention to the content of your experience, you'll be more aware of what the content is. But unless the context of paying attention is the aspiration for unconditional liberation, merely paying attention to what's happening in relationship to the content of your experience won't help you very much. So the illumination happens when we discover the context of consciousness itself, which is infinite. And it's only the discovery of the infinite context in which the awakening to consciousness reveals to us, that we can begin to see the content of our experience in its true light for what it actually is. So there's the context and the content of our experience. To repeat, it's very important to be aware of both. And I'm just going to repeat what I just said because it's important. For most of us, the context of our experience is the life of the small self. So the small self is having the experience of consciousness and the content of consciousness, usually within the narrow confines of the ego's agenda. When we aspire for something bigger than that, it begins to create a little pressure on the small world that the ego creates. Creates a little stress. So the practice of awareness, practicing of awareness is often emphasized the need to be aware of what's happening as it's happening. Always be aware of where you are. So do you see where you are moment to moment in your experience? Can you see where you are in relationship to your own hopes and to your own dreams? Now, what I learned from my guru is that, which I'm fond of saying, and you've all heard me say this before. He said, Andrew, remember that as nirvana has no beginning and no end, so samsara has no beginning and no end. So in terms of this whole question of what it means to pay attention, we can pay attention to our own experience in the context of being in hell, samsara, the world that the ego creates, individual and collective ego creates, or nirvana, which is an infinite, eternal realm of glorious freedom and transcendental liberation. So what's the context in which you are seeing your experience and having your experience? One point which endlessly fascinates me is the infinite nature of nirvana as its own context versus the infinite nature of samsara or hell. So when you're having an experience, you're having a painful experience, when your ego is hurting, is suffering, are you aware that you're in the hell realm that the ego creates for itself? Are you not only aware of your ego's pain and suffering, but are you aware of the context in which that suffering is being experienced? Because if the minute you are, you'll discover that there's a way out. And when you're lucky enough to have a glimpse of enlightened awareness, when you wake up to nirvanic potential, are you aware of it? When you have moments of ecstatic release, and you glimpse that which is infinite, that which has no beginning, has no end, the nature of which is a kind of uncaused happiness, happiness without cause. Are you aware of it? One has to be very sensitive to be aware of these kind of distinctions. When you're paying attention to your experience, are you aware of what's happening inside you? Are you aware of the fact that when you experience happiness, it might be the result of maybe getting what you want, like money or a new relationship, or a gift, or a new car, or a vacation? Are you aware of the nature of the happiness that comes from getting what you want, as being distinguished from a different kind of happiness that has no cause to it, causeless happiness, that springs forth from, it springs forth from the source of creation, from nowhere, and overwhelms you? And are you aware of the difference between happiness that comes from getting what you want versus happiness that comes for no reason? Are you aware of what's happening when it's happening? Or when you experience suffering, are you aware of what the cause of your suffering is? Are you a conscious enough person? Do you pay attention to the nature of the way your own mind works, and your own conditioned relationships, the nature of your own mind, to see what's triggering your feelings of despair, fear, doubt, anxiety, or depression? Are you aware of the mechanics of what's catalyzing your emotional states? Because a big part of waking up and being awake and paying attention is knowing what's happening and why it's happening. From the perspective of enlightened awareness, the worst thing is to be lost in your psychological experience. It's like being lost at sea, floating in the middle of the ocean late at night, all by yourself, not having any idea where you are, how to get out. So what we don't want to, if we're interested in waking up and awakening to spiritual freedom, we never want to get lost in that way. We never want to allow ourselves to get lost in that way. And one of the things that the Dharma makes clear to us is that there's always a way out. There's always a way out. It means to use a metaphorical example, the absolute principle, the absolute spiritual principle is always, she's always holding a hand out for us to grab onto in all difficult situations, if we have the eyes to recognize and the eyes to see it. When we awaken to enlightened awareness, we realize there's always a way out. There's always a way out. There's always a way out, no matter how bad and how dire the circumstances are, or how painful it might be. There's always a way out. But if you're going to find that way, you have to be willing to look for it. You have to be willing to want it. And the problem is that most of us are living lives in which we have never considered the possibility of inner freedom in a serious way, and in which we're living a life which is largely unconscious. It's based on largely unconscious attachments, unconscious fears, and unconscious desires. Not a lot of fun. So a big part of spiritual practice is doing what I'm speaking about, which is being conscious of what makes you tick, being your own best psychotherapist, to know what you're feeling and why you're feeling that way, and to be aware of the different ways that your thought processes affect your emotions, the way your emotions affect your thoughts. Become transparent to yourself, and to become independent in your belief in your own capacity to embrace higher freedom. If you want to be found, if you want to find yourself, if you want to be free, you have to have confidence in your own capacity to do it. The Buddha said to all his disciples, work out your own salvation with diligence, and I always found that a rather shocking teaching coming from the enlightened one, because I imagine his disciples must have been quite thrilled to have found one such as he. And in spite of the fact that he would seem to be the ultimate exemplar of the possible when it comes to enlightenment, the ultimate teacher and guide and mentor, he said to all of them, work out your own salvation with diligence, which is kind of saying you're on your own, kids. So my interpretation of that statement is that we have to believe in ourselves. You have to believe that you have the capacity to save yourself, to liberate yourself. It doesn't mean that you don't seek help from other people who can help you, accept their guidance. But in the end, we're all on our own in this. So there has to be a profound spiritual conviction that I can do this. And what that means in relation to what we're speaking about now is you have the capacity within your own awareness, the capacity to make choices, conscious choices, to liberate yourself, as far away as that might seem to you. From a certain point of view, being lost or being found is a choice. Because if you feel lost, as some of us do from time to time, or some of us do a lot of the time, if you feel lost, the worst thing you can do is to give in to being lost. There has to be a kind of relentless and ferocious intentionality in your aspiration to be awake, which means no matter what's happening, more than anything else, you believe in your own capacity to be aware and to be awake and to see through confusion and falsehood, even when it's hard, even when it feels impossible. But you're not going to back down and let go, but you're going to lean more into the challenge of seeing clearly. And that means being aware, making the effort to see what's actually happening, and not giving up. It's believing in yourself, believing in your own capacity for clarity and for salvation. So in this teaching, the idea is to, as I keep repeating, work on cultivating the desire for freedom So much so that you'll arrive at a point where you feel this independent inspiration to liberate yourself unconditionally as the most important aspiration in your life. Because you've realized that unless I can be free, unless I can liberate myself unconditionally from my own mind, my own crazy mind, and everybody else's crazy mind, I don't have a hope and a prayer that I'm going to be able to get through this on the right side of the tracks. So if you believe in yourself and you believe in your own capacity to do this, you're going to start paying much closer attention to your experience with greater ferocity and intensity, because you're going to know that the key to your own liberation is in your own capacity for seeing clearly, seeing your own experience clearly, just seeing into yourself with greater clarity. Because in the end, it's the choices we make and the actions we take that lead us to liberation or to hell. Right? As many spiritual teachers tell us, and that one of the things I've been fond of saying for a long time is that it's not what happens to us, it's not the experience we have, but our relationship to it that determines our capacity for freedom. So is there in your own experience a conviction? Because I can feel in my own experience of awareness, inherent in my experience of awareness and just the experience of paying attention to being aware, there's a ground of conviction. So my guru said to me, the only difference between enlightenment and unenlightenment is doubt. So are we present enough? Are we awake enough and present enough in our own experience of awakened consciousness to be able to face Mara or face doubt, face the temptress that is doubt without being intimidated? Because you have to be very awake and very aware to see the temptress or the tempter for who he or she is, and not to be frightened, not to be intimidated, not to back down, not to withdraw, not to crawl back into our hovel or to our cave in terror. And in order to be able to stand your ground, and all great realizers have to stand their ground in the face of enormous doubt, in the face of the temptation to doubt. That comes from the power of our own conviction that we experience, the very ground of our own experience of awareness. And in terms of the context of your experience, if you really want to do this, as I was saying earlier, you become aware that the ego has its own agenda. As nirvana has no beginning and no end, so samsara has no beginning and no end. So the ego has its own agenda, its own storyline, its own plans. The ego has other plans. The ego has its own agenda. The ego relates the present moment to the past and to the future based upon certain perceived needs and preferences that have nothing to do with spiritual freedom. That's the samsara part. The nirvana part is the awakening to what's called the true self or the authentic self. And when you have moments, when you awaken to your own true self, your own authentic self, you'll discover there's a completely different self sense inherently, it's inherently self-existing, always already inside of you, which most of us were not previously aware of. But when you awaken to that part of your own self, you experience a kind of happiness that's unimaginable, a joy and a lightness of being that has nothing to do with anything personal, a feeling of exhilaration and gratitude, and merely the fact of being conscious of existing, that is utterly intoxicating. And in these moments, you realize that your own experience of happiness, the experience of happiness that comes from where I'm calling the awakening to the true self, the authentic self, exists in a completely different category, a different dimension than the world that the ego operates in. It's like waking up from a nightmare. And it literally is waking up from a nightmare. And realizing, oh my God, I had no idea it was possible to be this happy, to be this free, to feel this free, to know this much joy, and to feel this much potential. And it doesn't seem to have anything to do with anything I've ever done in the past. It seems to exist in another dimension that's always available to me when I let go of the ego's world. So, as I always repeat on these calls, there's a difference between relative reality and absolute reality, and are you aware of the difference? Are you paying attention closely enough to your own experience to be aware of the huge distinction between the experience of relative reality and of absolute reality? Do you know the difference? Are you paying close enough attention to your own experience to know the difference between relative happiness, which is the result of the ego getting what it wants, or getting rid of what it doesn't like, versus absolute reality, which is the awakening to these deeper dimensions of our own self, which you experience in a kind of happiness that is uncaused, that self-exists, that's independently self-existing, always already. And the experience of that kind of happiness sets us free. It's an experience of liberation. It's like coming out of jail, coming out of a prison every time. And it's not the result of getting anything or doing anything. It's always only the result of letting go of everything. So if you start paying closer attention to your own experience and your relationship to your own mind and your own feelings, you'll realize that your own unhappiness, that the experience of being less than deeply and fully happy, is almost always a result of making the wrong choices in what we're identifying with in relationship to our thoughts and feelings. When we get too lost in relative reality, we begin to suffer a lot, as most of us do. And from the perspective of enlightened awareness, if you wonder why you're suffering so much, and you begin to pay attention to what you're identifying with, usually unconsciously, you start to see the causes of your own experiences of despair and disappointment. So if you want to be free and you want to be gloriously happy, you have to be willing to let go of anything and everything that would hold you back from being completely free, which takes enormous courage and profound inspiration, and the practice of enormous attention to the context of your experience, attention to the choices that you're making. How conscious are you of the choices that you're making and where those choices are coming from in you? So many of our thoughts and feelings are so deeply conditioned and robotic. So much of our relationship to life is conditioned and unfree. And if you begin to pay more attention to what's happening inside of you, you'll see it for yourself. So there's the context of your experience and the content of your experience. The relationship to the content always depends upon the context in which you're choosing. From this perspective of enlightened awareness, to be in hell is a choice, and to be in heaven is also a choice. Once you know where heaven is and what hell is, then you have a choice. If you don't know any better, you don't know what you're doing. It's like being lost in the desert, lost at sea, drowning in the ocean, utterly lost and not even knowing it. But once you have seen deeply into the nature of your own mind, and the nature of the mind, the nature of heaven, the nature of hell, then you always have a choice. So at a certain point, after we have a certain amount of experience, it becomes apparent to us that we have a choice to be liberated. Sometime around nowish. If we're willing to make the right choices, if we're willing to let go of everything that keeps us ensnared in hell, and freedom is ours. Just like the experience I had that morning on the beach, it's never far away. But we have to really want it. So are you aware of the context of your experience, the context of you that you're choosing? Fears and desires. It's very important that we are found, that we find ourselves. And don't allow ourselves to be lost. Don't allow yourself to be lost. Most of us have wasted far too much precious time being lost. If you want to be free, you have to find yourself and know where you are. Be aware of the choices that you're making and where they're coming from. Be aware of the context in which your choices are being made. Always pay attention to what you're doing and why you're doing it. Your true self is always paying attention. The ego is always distracted. When you wake up from your ego, and you awaken to the true self, you'll realize that you're always paying attention, but you didn't even know it. It's a shock. It's an exhilarating shock. And it's kind of mind-bending. When you have that realization that you've always been paying attention, you always have been seeing deeply, but you simply weren't aware of it because you were lost in the drama of the small self and didn't even know you were lost. So paradoxically, when you wake up from being lost, you realize that from at the highest level, you were never lost. You were always free. But if that's true, it's not going to do you any good unless you actually know it. So it's important to do the spiritual work necessary to be able to realize this very consciously and conscientiously, and then take responsibility for it and embrace it with all of your heart, and then to live it.